Sergeant Tom Miller's shift was nearly over when something unusual caught his eye. Sitting motionless by the rusted gate of a rundown animal shelter was a German shepherd, thin and battered, as if it had been waiting for someone. The warm glow of the setting sun highlighted the exhaustion in the dog's eyes, an expression that held more than hunger or abandonment. Tom pulled his patrol car over and stepped out, his curiosity piqued. The moment his eyes met the dog's, he felt a chill run through him. It was like staring into a shadow of his past. Tom crouched down near the gate, his gaze fixed on the dog. The strong stench of filth and neglect wafted from the shelter, but Tom barely noticed. His focus was on the worn collar wrapped around the dog's neck, its metal tag dulled by time. With trembling hands, he reached for it and rubbed off the dirt. When he read the engraving, his breath caught in his throat. Shadow, property of Tom Miller. The words hit him like a bolt of lightning. Shadow, his K-9 partner who had vanished 3 years ago during a chaotic police operation, stood before him. Alive, against all odds. Shadow? Is it really you? Tom whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of disbelief and raw emotion. The German shepherd tilted his head, his tail wagging faintly in what could only be recognition. But as relief washed over Tom, it was replaced by something darker. Shadow looked frail, his coat dull and scarred. The marks on his body weren't just from neglect, they were from abuse. Tom clenched his fists, anger bubbling to the surface. Who had done this to him? And how had Shadow ended up in this place? Determined to find answers, Tom pounded on the shelter's door until a disheveled employee appeared. Where did this dog come from? Tom demanded, pointing to Shadow. The man shrugged indifferently. Picked him up off the streets a few months back, he replied flatly. That's all I know. But Tom wasn't buying it. Shadow's condition told a story far worse than life as a stray. Someone had hurt him, and whoever it was, they weren't going to get away with it. As Tom gently helped Shadow into the back seat of his patrol car, he ran a hand over the dog's head, his emotions swirling. Relief, guilt, and a simmering anger all fought for space in his chest. Shadow's scars weren't just physical. They carried the weight of a harrowing journey that neither of them could yet fully understand. Tom made a silent vow right then and there. He would bring Shadow home, but he wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth about those missing 3 years. Shadow's eyes seemed to hold answers, but they also warned of something darker. What Tom was about to uncover might not only explain Shadow's scars, it might change everything. Tom sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as Shadow lay silently in the back seat. The German shepherd's breathing was shallow, his body curled up in a way that made him look smaller than Tom remembered. As the car rolled through the quiet streets of Green Valley, memories of their time together flooded Tom's mind. Shadow had been more than a partner. He had been a lifeline, a loyal friend during some of the darkest moments of Tom's life. And now, looking at the broken version of the dog he once knew, Tom felt a crushing wave of guilt. "Where have you been, buddy?" Tom muttered under his breath, glancing at Shadow through the rearview mirror. Shadow didn't move, but his eyes opened slightly, as if acknowledging the question. Tom's mind raced with possibilities. How could a dog as highly trained as Shadow have ended up abandoned and abused? The thought of Shadow being hurt while Tom lived his life as if he were gone tore at him. The scars on Shadow's body weren't just random, they were deliberate. Someone had done this, and Tom intended to find out who. When they finally pulled into Tom's driveway, the house looked eerily still in the fading twilight. He stepped out and opened the back door, gently coaxing Shadow to follow. The dog hesitated for a moment before hopping out, his movements slow and stiff, a clear sign of lingering pain. Tom knelt beside him, running his hand along Shadow's back. "We'll get through this," he whispered, his voice soft but firm. Shadow's ears twitched slightly, but his gaze stayed distant, as if haunted by memories Tom couldn't see. Inside the house, Tom grabbed a blanket and laid it out on the living room floor. Shadow collapsed onto it almost immediately, letting out a heavy sigh. Tom sat down beside him, stroking the dog's head gently. His mind wandered to the shelter employee's words. Picked him up off the streets a few months back. That wasn't enough. He needed more answers. Something about the shelter felt off. The employee's evasive tone, the lack of concern for Shadow's condition. It didn't sit right with Tom, and his instincts, honed over years as a cop, told him there was more to the story. Tom grabbed his laptop and began searching for information about the shelter. As he scrolled through reviews and articles, a pattern started to emerge. Complaints about neglect, mistreatment, and even animals disappearing without explanation. Tom's stomach tightened as he clicked on an article detailing an investigation that had been quietly closed months ago. The pieces weren't adding up, and the uneasy feeling in his gut only grew stronger. Looking over at Shadow, who was now fast asleep, Tom made a silent vow. He wouldn't rest until he uncovered the truth. Not just about the shelter, but about what had happened to Shadow during those 3 missing years. The next morning, Tom sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee as Shadow rested on the floor beside him. The German Shepherd seemed calmer now, though his movements were still stiff. Every so often, Shadow's ears twitched at a sound from outside, but his eyes remained closed. Tom couldn't help but wonder what memories played behind those tired eyes. He absent-mindedly stroked Shadow's head, his mind racing with everything he had uncovered the night before. The shelter wasn't just neglectful. It had a history of controversy that no one seemed eager to talk about. Tom knew he couldn't leave it at that. After feeding Shadow a small meal and making sure he was comfortable, Tom grabbed his badge and headed back to the shelter. The air felt heavy as he parked in front of the rundown building. The cracked paint and sagging roof only added to the feeling of unease that lingered around the place. He stepped inside, immediately hit by the sharp stench of disinfectant failing to mask something far worse. The same disinterested employee from the day before sat at the desk, scrolling through his phone. "Back again?" the man muttered without looking up. Tom placed both hands on the counter, his voice firm. "I need to know more about where that German Shepherd came from. Records, details, anything you've got." The man sighed dramatically and leaned back in his chair. "Look, like I told you, we found him wandering near the industrial area. No tags, no microchip, nothing. That's all there is to it." Tom narrowed his eyes, his instincts telling him the man was lying, or at least withholding something. "You're telling me a trained dog like that just showed up out of nowhere? And what about those scars? You really expect me to believe no one here noticed the condition he was in?" The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing toward a door in the back of the room. "Look, I just work the front desk. If you've got questions about intake, you'll need to talk to the manager. But she's not here today." Tom didn't buy it. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Then give me her name and number. Now." The man hesitated, but Tom's piercing gaze didn't waver. Reluctantly, the employee scribbled down a name and phone number on a sticky note, sliding it across the counter without another word. As Tom walked back to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something much darker going on behind the shelter's closed doors. His gut told him Shadow's time here wasn't random. There was a connection waiting to be uncovered. Climbing into his car, he looked at the sticky note in his hand. The name, Deborah Watts, stared back at him, and Tom knew this would be his next step. But the real question loomed in his mind. Would Shadow's scars lead to answers, or something far worse? Tom wasted no time dialing the number scribbled on the sticky note. After a few rings, a voice answered, sharp and brisk. "This is Deborah Watts," the woman said, her tone clipped, as if she didn't have time for small talk. "Ms. Watts, this is Sergeant Tom Miller with the Green Valley Police Department. I'm calling about a German Shepherd that was recently at your shelter. I need to know more about where he came from and what happened to him while he was there." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Tom could hear the faint sound of papers rustling before she finally responded. "I'm not sure how much help I can be, Sergeant. We deal with dozens of animals every month. I'd have to check the records." "That's exactly what I need," Tom replied firmly. "His name is Shadow. Black and tan German Shepherd. Scars on his body. Underweight. Does that ring a bell?" Another pause. This one felt heavier. I'll have to look into it," Deborah said finally, her voice quieter now. But I can tell you, Sergeant, we do our best here. We're underfunded and overworked. Sometimes animals come to us in bad shape, and there's only so much we can do. Tom wasn't buying it. Shadow didn't just come to you in bad shape. He has scars that didn't happen on the streets. Someone hurt him. You're telling me no one noticed that? Deborah's tone shifted defensively. I can't control what happens before the animals get here. We don't always know their history. Tom felt his frustration rising, but he held it back. Fine. I'll be at the shelter this afternoon. I expect to see those records when I arrive. Before she could respond, he hung up. When Tom arrived at the shelter later that day, Deborah was waiting for him near the front desk. She was a thin woman in her early 50s, her face lined with stress. She carried a clipboard and looked more nervous than he expected. "Sergeant Miller," she greeted, forcing a smile. "I've pulled what we have on the dog you mentioned. But I'll be honest, it's not much." Deborah handed him a thin folder, and Tom opened it immediately. Inside were intake forms with barely any information, found near industrial area. No tags. Approximate age: 5 years. But one thing stood out, a handwritten note in the corner of the form. It read, "Referred by source. Confidential." "What's this supposed to mean?" Tom asked, pointing to the note. Deborah hesitated, glancing at the door behind her. "Sometimes we get animals brought to us directly by people who don't want to leave their names. It's not uncommon." Tom's eyes narrowed. "Who brought Shadow here? Deborah? And why would someone go through the trouble of keeping their identity secret?" Deborah opened her mouth to respond but stopped short. The faint sound of barking came from the back of the shelter, followed by a loud thud. Her face paled. I need to check on that," she stammered, stepping away quickly. Tom watched her disappear through the door, his instincts on high alert. Something was wrong here, very wrong. And whatever secrets Deborah was trying to protect, Tom was determined to uncover them. Shadow's scars weren't the end of this story. They were just the beginning. Tom didn't wait for Deborah to come back. The barking and the heavy thud from the back of the shelter unsettled him, every nerve on high alert. Pushing through the door she had entered, he stepped into a dimly lit hallway cluttered with crates and rusted equipment. The air was thick with the acrid smell of bleach, but underneath it lingered a foul stench that turned his stomach. At the end of the corridor, a heavy metal door stood slightly ajar, faint voices spilling out into the silence. "I told you not to leave that dog out front," a man hissed, his voice sharp and irritated. "It's bad enough we had to take him in. Now there's a cop sticking his nose where it doesn't belong." Tom's pulse quickened. He moved closer, careful not to make a sound. Another voice, Deborah's, replied, trembling with frustration. "What was I supposed to do?" He came asking questions. "I didn't sign up for this." That was all Tom needed to hear. Pushing the door open with force, he stepped inside, his badge already raised. The room fell silent as Deborah and a wiry man in a stained shelter uniform turned to face him. Deborah's face paled instantly, while the man's expression twisted into a scowl. The room smelled even worse than the hallway, and Tom's sharp eyes caught sight of metal cages stacked along the walls. Most were empty, but a small dog whimpered in one, trembling in fear. Tom's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "You've got 2 seconds to explain what's going on here. Who brought Shadow in, and what's being hidden?" The man crossed his arms, trying to project defiance. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said flatly, but the faint tremor in his voice betrayed him. Deborah broke first. "I didn't want any part of this," she said, her voice shaking. She pointed to the man, "brought Shadow in one night, said to keep it off the records. That's all I know, I swear." Tom's jaw tightened as he turned his focus back to the man. "Who gave the orders? And what's really going on here?" The man smirked, his arrogance barely masking his fear. "You really don't get it, do you? Shadow's just one piece of a much bigger operation. You think this is about one dog? You're way out of your depth, cop." Before Tom could push him further, the screech of tires outside shattered the silence. The man's eyes darted toward the sound, and a faint grin tugged at his lips. "You shouldn't have come here," he muttered. You just made yourself a problem for the wrong people. Tom's hand instinctively moved to his holster as the weight of the situation hit him. Shadow scars weren't just the story of one dog's suffering. They were a trail leading to something far bigger and far more dangerous. And now, it seemed, the people behind it were ready to take action. Tom bolted back into the hallway, his pulse pounding as he approached the shelter's front entrance. Outside, the screeching of tires had been replaced by the low rumble of an idling engine. Through the grimy front windows, he spotted a black SUV parked near his car, its tinted windows concealing whoever was inside. His instincts screamed danger. Pulling his radio from his belt, he called in for backup. "Dispatch, this is Sergeant Miller. I need units at Green Valley Animal Shelter ASAP. Possible hostile activity." His voice was calm, but the tension coiled in his chest like a spring. As Tom stepped outside, the SUV's engine roared to life, and the vehicle sped off, kicking up gravel as it disappeared down the road. He memorized the license plate before returning inside. Deborah stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale, while the wiry man from earlier slunk into the shadows. Tom's jaw tightened. Whoever was in that SUV wasn't just here by coincidence, they'd been watching. Who the hell was that? Tom demanded, his sharp gaze fixed on Deborah. I don't know, she stammered, her voice trembling. They don't tell me anything. You just what? Tom snapped. You've been covering for them? Do you even know what you're involved in? Deborah shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I didn't have a choice. They fund this place. If I didn't cooperate, the shelter would have shut down years ago. I thought it was just donations at first. But then they started bringing animals. I didn't ask questions, and I didn't want to know. Tom's stomach churned at her admission. And Shadow? Where does he fit into this? The wiry man emerged from the shadows, his expression colder than before. He wasn't supposed to stay here. He's different. When they brought him, they said he was special. Some kind of asset they didn't want falling into the wrong hands. Guess that means you. Tom stepped closer to the man, his voice a low growl. Who are they? Names, locations, I want everything you've got. The man snorted, his arrogance returning. You think they'd tell me that? I'm nobody to them, same as her. But trust me, cop, they're already cleaning this up. You're not ready for the kind of people you're messing with. Before Tom could press further, the sound of distant sirens reached his ears. Backup was arriving. The man's smirk faltered, and Deborah visibly sagged in relief. Tom turned toward the door, but his mind was spinning. Shadow wasn't just a stray or a victim. Whatever had been done to him was part of something bigger, something calculated. And the SUV's sudden appearance was no coincidence. As the first patrol cars pulled into the lot, Tom knew one thing for sure. The people behind this weren't just going to walk away. And now, by digging into Shadow's past, he'd put himself in their crosshairs. Tom watched as the patrol cars rolled into the shelter's gravel lot, their red and blue lights flashing against the darkening sky. 2 officers stepped out, their hands instinctively resting on their belts as they approached him. The SUV was long gone, but the tension in the air was palpable. Tom gestured for them to follow him back inside, where Deborah and the wiry man were still waiting. Both looked shaken, though the man tried to maintain his defiant posture. Sergeant Miller, one of the officers said, "What's the situation here?" Tom quickly filled them in, keeping his voice steady but clipped. "We've got evidence of illegal activity tied to this shelter, animal abuse at the very least, but potentially something much bigger. The people funding this place aren't just donors. They're connected to Shadow, my K9 partner, and they've been watching us. An SUV just fled the scene before you arrived. I've got a plate number we need to run." The officers nodded, and one stepped outside to radio dispatch for further instructions. Meanwhile, Tom turned his attention back to Deborah and the wiry man. "You're both coming with me for questioning," he said firmly. "If you're as uninvolved as you claim, now's your chance to prove it." Deborah hesitated, but the man scoffed. "You think hauling us in is going to solve anything? You're already in over your head." Ignoring him, Tom motioned to the second officer to escort them out. As they were led to the waiting patrol cars, Tom glanced back at the shelter. The smell of bleach and filth lingered in his nose, but something else stuck with him. Shadow's scars, the cryptic comment about him being different, and the SUV's ominous presence. None of it added up yet, but the pieces were there. With Deborah and the wiry man secured, Tom returned to his own car. Shadow was curled up on the back seat, his ears twitching at the sound of approaching footsteps. Tom opened the door, gently resting a hand on the dog's head. "Don't worry, boy," he said softly. "We'll figure this out." Shadow's amber eyes locked on his, as if to say he understood. As Tom sat behind the wheel, his phone buzzed. It was a call from the officer who had run the SUV's plates. The news wasn't good. "Sergeant, the plates are registered to a shell company. No owner, no address. It's a dead end." Tom cursed under his breath. Whoever was behind this had resources, enough to cover their tracks. Looking at Shadow in the rearview mirror, he knew this was far from over. He wasn't just dealing with local criminals. He was up against something organized, dangerous, and relentless. And now, by taking Shadow into his care, he had made himself part of their problem. Tom tightened his grip on the wheel. If they thought he'd back down, they didn't know him at all. Shadow's scars were a testament to survival, and Tom would see this through, no matter what it took. The following morning, Tom stood in his small home office, staring at the evidence he'd collected. Shadow lay nearby on a blanket, his breathing steady but shallow. The dog's recovery was slow, but there was something resolute in his demeanor, something that mirrored Tom's own determination. On the desk in front of him was the intake form from the shelter, the cryptic, referred by source. Confidential note glaring up at him. He knew this was the thread that could unravel everything if pulled hard enough. Tom picked up the phone and called Detective Sarah Martinez, an old colleague he trusted implicitly. She had a knack for digging into trails that others couldn't follow. Within minutes, her no-nonsense voice crackled through the line. "Miller, what's this about? Sounds bigger than your usual." Tom explained everything. Shadow's disappearance, the scars, the shelter, the SUV, and the dead-end license plate. As he spoke, he heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath. "You're dealing with something organized," she said. "If that SUV's tied to a shell company, it's no accident. They've got layers to protect themselves. But that note on the intake form? Confidential source? That's a weak link, and weak links can break. Send me everything you've got, and I'll see what I can dig up." Relief washed over Tom as he emailed Sarah the files. Hanging up, he turned to Shadow, who had shifted to watch him closely. "We'll get to the bottom of this," Tom said, his voice steady but low. Shadow's ears twitched, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. Hours later, Sarah called back with a lead. The shelter has connections to a nonprofit group called Greenreach. They've been flagged for financial irregularities before, but nothing ever stuck. Here's the kicker. They also operate out of the industrial area where Shadow was supposedly found. My gut says you should start there. Tom felt the pieces begin to align. The industrial area was the same place the shelter had claimed to find Shadow, and if Greenreach had something to hide, it wasn't a coincidence. He grabbed his jacket and whistled for Shadow, who struggled to his feet, eager to follow. "I know you're not at full strength, boy," Tom said, kneeling beside him. "But I need you on this one." Shadow leaned into Tom's hand, his scars a silent reminder of how far they'd both come. As they drove toward the industrial area, the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the empty streets. Tom parked a few blocks away from the Greenreach building, a nondescript warehouse that looked abandoned at first glance. But as he watched, he noticed faint movement, a shadow passing by one of the windows. "This is it," Tom muttered, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. He looked back at Shadow, who sat alert in the back seat. "Ready, partner?" Shadow's ears perked up, and Tom felt a flicker of the bond they'd once shared. Whatever lay behind those walls, they were stepping into it together. Tom parked a block away from the Greenreach warehouse, scanning the area carefully. The building was plain and weathered, blending in with the other abandoned structures in the industrial district. But the faint glow of light from one of the windows and the occasional shadow passing inside told him this place wasn't as empty as it appeared. Shadow sat in the back seat, his ears alert, as if sensing the tension in the air. "Stay close, boy," Tom murmured, opening the car door. Shadow jumped out, his movements still slow but steady. Tom crouched next to him, running a hand over his fur. "We've been through worse. Let's see what they're hiding." Moving quietly, they approached the warehouse, sticking to the shadows. As they got closer, Tom noticed a side door slightly ajar. He peered inside and saw a dimly lit room filled with crates stacked haphazardly. The faint sound of muffled voices reached his ears, mixed with the occasional scrape of something being dragged across the floor. Tom signaled for Shadow to stay close as they slipped inside. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals and something else, something metallic and unsettling. He ducked behind a crate, peering into the main room. Two men stood near a cage, speaking in hushed tones. Inside the cage was a dog, smaller than Shadow, its ribs visible and its body trembling. Tom's blood boiled as he pieced it together. This wasn't just about neglect. It was organized trafficking, dogs being used for reasons he could only begin to imagine. Shadow let out a low growl, his body tense, but Tom placed a calming hand on him. "Not yet," he whispered. The men moved toward the back of the warehouse, disappearing through another door. Tom knew this was his chance. He crept closer to the cage, pulling a pocket knife to cut the latch. The dog inside backed into the corner, fear evident in its wide eyes. "It's okay," Tom whispered. "You're safe now." But as the latch fell free, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. Tom spun around, his hand moving to his holster. A man stood there, his face cold and unflinching, a crowbar in his hand. "You shouldn't have come here," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. Tom didn't hesitate. "You've got two choices," he said, his voice steady. "Walk away, or I bring this entire operation down right now." Behind him, Shadow stepped forward, his growl growing louder, a reminder that Tom wasn't alone. The man with the crowbar held his ground, but his smirk was gone. Shadow's growl, low and menacing, filled the space. "You don't know what you've gotten into," the man said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his nerves. Tom didn't flinch, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon. "I know enough," Tom replied, his tone cold. "Dogs like Shadow don't end up in places like this by chance. Who's behind this? What's the connection to him?" He took a step forward, his eyes locking on the man's, daring him to make a move. Before the man could answer, the screech of tires pierced the silence. Tom turned toward the source of the noise, his body tensing as bright headlights lit up the warehouse. The rumble of an engine idling outside sent a wave of dread through him. Moments later, the front door burst open, and three armed men entered, their weapons drawn but not yet aimed. "You should have walked away, cop," one of them said, his voice sharp and commanding. Shadow stepped closer to Tom, his growl rising as his body coiled, ready to protect. Tom raised his hands slightly, keeping his movements deliberate. "If you fire those guns, you'll have an entire precinct on your back in minutes. Is that what you want?" he said, his voice calm but firm. The leader laughed coldly. "That's not how this ends." He motioned to the man with the crowbar, but Shadow lunged forward with a bark that echoed through the room. The sudden movement startled the men, and in that split second, Tom drew his weapon, aiming squarely at the leader. "Enough!" Tom shouted. "Drop the weapons and leave, or this ends here." The distant sound of sirens grew louder, and the leader cursed under his breath. "This isn't over," he hissed, retreating with his men as Shadow stood firm, his presence a silent warning. Tom exhaled slowly, knowing this battle was only the beginning. The morning after the confrontation at the warehouse, Tom sat in his living room, Shadow resting at his feet. The distant wail of sirens and the chaos of the previous night still echoed in his mind. Though the armed men had fled, the operation wasn't over. Evidence left behind in the warehouse, the crates, shipping manifests, and malnourished dogs, had been enough to launch a full investigation. Tom knew the trail wouldn't end here, but for now, his focus was on Shadow. Tom glanced down at his partner. Shadow's scars told a story of survival, but his eyes, now softer and less haunted, told of trust renewed. The bond they had shared before Shadow's disappearance wasn't gone. It had only been buried under years of pain and uncertainty. Tom reached down, resting a hand on Shadow's head. "We've been through hell, boy, but we made it. And we're not done yet." The investigation into the warehouse unearthed a network of illegal animal trafficking that stretched far beyond Green Valley. Shadow, it turned out, had been one of many dogs taken and trained for purposes that were both cruel and highly profitable. The scars on his body weren't just from abuse. They were from the brutal conditioning he had endured to break his spirit. But Shadow had resisted, escaped, and survived long enough to find his way back to Tom. In the weeks that followed, arrests were made, and the shelter was shut down. Deborah cooperated, providing names and details that led to the unraveling of the operation. The man with the crowbar and his associates were apprehended, though the shadowy figure funding the network remained elusive. Still, Tom knew their time would come. For now, justice had been served, and dozens of rescued animals were on the path to recovery. One crisp autumn morning, Tom stood in the park with Shadow by his side, the dog's tail wagging gently as they walked together. It wasn't the same as before. Shadow moved slower, his body still recovering, but the bond between them was stronger than ever. As they stopped near the edge of a serene lake, Tom knelt down, looking into Shadow's warm, amber eyes. "You've been through a lot, partner," he said softly. "But you're home now. We both are." Shadow leaned into him, a quiet affirmation that they'd face whatever came next, together.